Hi, everyone. I'm so sorry that Anna and I cannot be with you this week. Our prayers are with you, but we had some things pop up that just became unavoidable and we have to attend to. But Father Bob, our Father General, had asked me to go ahead and give this talk and suggested that maybe doing this in a recorded session might be maybe not the same, but could be something that we could enjoy together. I've been thinking a lot over the last year and a half, almost 2 years now, about what mission means in the context of being a missionary of St. John. When I came up to Emmanuel Mission and Hope Oscoda, one of my concerns is that although things have been going very smoothly for 20 years or so, what I was beginning to see with our volunteer staff and everything was a big disconnect between what it meant to simply be a volunteer and what it meant to be a missionary. And I really wanted that focus to be on being a missionary. We can do a lot of things here at Emmanuel Mission. We can be a homeless shelter. We can do it just like, one of the homeless shelters downstate or across state. But I'm not sure that's really our calling here. In fact, as I've been praying about it and as I've been discerning, I really believe that our calling is to be a true mission, a gathering of missionaries put together not only for the worship of God, but for the service of this community and specifically this homeless community here. So a number of months back, I started to do a series of teachings called Rediscovering Mission, because I wanted us to see that there was something so much more than just the mechanics of doing a mission, and that there was a biblical foundation to how we can do this, and the biblical foundation of how we go about our lives. Back in 2006, a dozen guys met over at St. John the Apostle, trying to discern what our way forward was going to be. We were kind of abandoned. We were kind of floating along going, I don't know. I want to be in mission. I want to be in ministry. I'm a Catholic. What do I do? What came out of that, I think it was very providential. What came out of that was a group called the Missionary Society of St. John the Evangelist. There were two elements in there that were so, for lack of a better word, providential, that I think if we skip over it, we're going to miss something. One was that we were called part of St. John the Evangelist. So we knew that part of what we were doing was to spread the good news. But then we chose that word missionary. We were going to be a missionary society. There had already been a society of St. John the Evangelist, and it was a good society. It did a lot of good things, very Anglo-Catholic. I'll talk about them a little bit more later. But so we could have used something along that line and not had the word missionary attached to it, but we attached the word missionary. We were going to be a missionary society. And I'm not sure that we really understood at the time what that was going to entail. I'm not sure that we understood fully what being a missionary society could be. But now, all these years later, as we have grown as a society, I think now is a good time for us to begin to look at what that missionary part of who we are can mean, about what we do and how we go forward. And since we've all been missionaries of some form or another, most of us are in areas of the country and doing mission or doing ministry in areas that not a lot of other people are involved in, especially not a lot of other Anglicans. And that's a good thing. That's a very good thing. And that is something to do with mission. But let me go back a little bit and talk about our biblical foundation for ministry. It may surprise you, or maybe not. Most of you are fairly steeped in the Holy Scriptures, but it may come as a little bit of an awakening to understand that our call to mission does not begin in the New Testament. Our call to mission actually goes back to the very beginning. It goes back to the calling of Abraham. Maybe even a little further. If we go back to the absolute beginning, when God creates man and woman, he says, let us create man in our image. And a lot of times we end up focusing in on what that means in terms of our creativity. We talk about that in terms of our capacity for relationship. We talk about it in all those senses, but what we rarely talk about is that by God saying, let us create man in our own image, he is actually placing us as his representatives in this world. In a sense, you and I are called to do what God wants done in this world. We are his representatives. We do the things that he would do. And so we are to be carrying out that all important aspect of ministering and of relieving and dealing with sin and dealing with the consequences of sin and helping to restore humanity to what it's called to be. But then we go on and we get down to the calling of Abraham, and God calls Abraham out of an ordinary life. And he says, I'm going to send you somewhere. You're not going to know where I'm going to send you, but when we get there, I'll tell you we're here. And along the way, I'm going to start fulfilling some promises to you, because through you, I want to do something great. And so he gives Abraham this vision of the future, this vision of having sons and generations more numerous than the stars of heaven, more populous than the grains of sand, and it all starts with one person. It starts with Isaac, and so Isaac is born. And then God asked the unthinkable. Actually, it wasn't all that unthinkable. Actually, it would have been a common thing among the people of Canaan to offer their son in sacrifice as a show of their commitment. And so he takes Abraham aside and he says, I want you to offer your son as a sacrifice to me. And Abraham goes ahead and he tries to do it. He tries to follow through. He makes every attempt to say, I know God has promised something to me, and I don't understand how he's going to bring something out of this horrible thing that he's asking me to do, but I know he's going to bring something good out of it. So he takes Isaac up and he goes to sacrifice him. God provides the sacrifice. He says, no, I know now that you will do what I ask you to. But then he points to Isaac, and he tells Abraham, he says, Abraham, in your offspring, I am going to bless the world. So there's something about the called out people of God that is meant to bless the world. It's meant to give blessing to the world. It's meant to take the world and leave it a better place than it started off with. And so this begins, and it begins with Isaac and Jacob and Esau, and then Jacob has sons, and these sons end up selling off their youngest son, or their youngest brother, or almost youngest brother, into slavery, into Egypt. And God does something great out of that. He begins to bless the world through the offspring of Abraham. Through the offspring of Abraham, Joseph in Egypt, set up as Pharaoh's right-hand man, he begins making provision for this famine that's coming. And not only does he save his family, he saves the people surrounding Egypt. He makes sure that everybody's okay and that people are blessed through a follower of God. And then there arises a man who doesn't know Joseph. There's a Pharaoh that doesn't know Joseph, and so he sees the Hebrews and he says, there's a good source of labor over there. I'm going to use them. And so Israel goes into slavery for like 400 years. And they cry out to God. They say that this burden is too much for us to bear. It's horrible. It's terrible. Why have you abandoned us? Come, God, get us. Help us. Get us out of this situation. And so after 400 years, God says, okay, it's time. Why wait? Why does God wait all that time to release his chosen people? There's a good reason for it. And you're going to hear it in just a minute. Sometimes the longer it takes God to respond to something that we're asking, even though you and I may be able to see, oh my gosh, if God doesn't intervene here, it's all going to fall apart, is that God is preparing us for the work that he's going to do. He's getting us ready. So Israel's been in this time of slavery, and he sends Moses, and he takes the children of Israel out through miraculous means and crosses the sea and brings them to the mount. Okay? He brings them to Sinai, and there God gives them the law. Now, an interesting thing happens when God starts giving this law. It's not just about moral things that they must do in order to relate to God. And it's not just about how they are going to treat each other. God also includes in that words on how they're going to treat their neighbors around them. There are cautions. There are cautions not to follow the trajectory that Canaan has followed, that Egypt has followed, that all of these people have followed into idolatry and into these horrible things that they do. But there are also provisions for these folks. How is Israel to react to the strangers in their midst? How are they going to react with the poor, not only their own poor, but the poor that come from outside of them? How are they going to interact with that? And so God starts laying down some laws in here. In the book of Leviticus, which for some reason most of us don't tend to read, even though there's some really great stuff in there. In the book of Leviticus in chapter 19, God starts to, or this is one of the places that God starts to lay out why and how Israel is going to react to the poor and the helpless and the foreigner in their midst and all that kind of stuff. So if this works, I'm going to share my screen with you. And sharing my screen with you, I'm going to show you. Here we go. Okay. So God says, when you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap your field right up to its edge. Neither shall you gather the gleanings after your harvest. You shall not strip your vineyard bare, neither shall you gather the fallen grapes out of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and for the sojourner. I am the Lord your God. You shall not steal. You shall not deal falsely. You shall not lie to one another. You shall not swear by my name falsely and so profane the name of the Lord your God. I am the Lord. You shall not oppress your neighbor or rob him. The wages of a hired worker shall not remain with you all night until the morning. You shall not curse the deaf or put a stumbling block before the blind. But you shall fear the Lord your God, or you shall fear your God. I am the Lord. Okay? So he keeps on going across this, and he's going, this is how you're going to deal with your neighbor. You're going to deal with them as I dealt with you. And that's the key. I am the Lord your God, and therefore you are going to react to your neighbor, to the poor, to those who are needy in exactly the same way that I dealt with you. Let me see if I can pull up Deuteronomy here. Well, actually, let's go back to Leviticus 19. We'll do this. And we're going to go all the way down to verse 33. So God starts dealing with the strangers. Okay. God starts dealing with all of them. And he said, when a stranger sojourns with you in your land, you shall not do him wrong. You shall treat the stranger who sojourns with you as the native among you, and you shall love him as yourself. For you were strangers in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. And there's the kicker. There is the kicker. God says, I want you to remember what you went through in Egypt. I want you to have that in mind, because I am the Lord your God, and I heard you and I responded. Therefore, the stranger in your midst, the foreigner, the poor, the oppressed, the homeless, all these people who you could easily just put off to the side and say, you're just not part of our community. God is saying, you respond to them how I responded to you. You reach in and you save them. You reach in and you relieve their burden. And that begins to be a theme throughout all of the rest of the Old Testament. You remember where you came from. God talks about it in Deuteronomy. You remember that you were a slave. You remember this when you have your interactions with one another. You remember this when you have your interactions with the nations around you. You remember that you were a slave and you could not save yourself. And I stepped in and I saved you. That is so important. That is so important to who we are as Christians, as a community of Christians. And so, all through the prophets, the minor prophets especially, oh my gosh, I love how the minor prophets deal with all this. In Amos and Micah and Obadiah and Zephaniah and all these guys, they sit there and they say to the people of Judah and the people of Israel, you're in trouble. And you're in trouble not because you've ignored how to worship God properly. Heck, you worship God properly all the time as far as we're concerned. Except that at the same time you're thinking about how you're going to cheat the poor. Except at the same time, you're thinking how you're going to oppress the widow and the orphan. Except that you've forgotten where you came from. You forgot that you were once a slave and that God reached in and took you and saved you and made you a people. All the way down to, and I love this one. I'm going to bring this one up, and you're going to, hopefully you'll enjoy this. This is my favorite. Micah 6:8. We find ourselves so many times sitting around and asking ourselves, what does God want from me? What does God want me to do? Micah 6:8. He has told you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you but to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God? Man, if that doesn't get to the heart of it, I don't know what does. We as Christians are supposed to be about justice and mercy or kindness and right relationship with God. And often we find ourselves spending all of our time working on the right relationship with God, and we forget that we're supposed to be acting justly towards those around us, justly with one another, but also justly with those who surround our community. I think that's what God has been trying to teach me over the last couple of years, is that it's really, really good to get this whole Anglican thing right, to get this whole Anglo-Catholic thing right. That's really good. That's wonderful. The beauty of worship and the tradition and the heritage. That's that's so great. But equally important, Tim, is the justice you mete out, is the mercy you show. And that is supposed to be informing what we do. And I can see that as being something that would be great for us as a missionary society to really embrace wholeheartedly. That it's not just about getting getting the visuals right. I guess that's the best way I can say it. Getting the visuals right and getting the purity of our doctrine right. Those are good and those are important. But just as important is the kind of mercy and the kind of justice that we mete out. We have the opportunity to come into a community, or we're already in communities, and to really stand for something that the people, whether they're Christian or not, are going to look at us and say, oh my gosh, they're about something good. They're about something that will make a difference in people's lives. Now, you and I may understand that as meaning we've got to work with this in order to get them to God. But that's not a bad thing. That's not a bad thing at all. So we move into the New Testament and we start seeing Jesus talking in the Sermon on the Mount, we hear him starting to talk about blessed are those who show mercy. Blessed are the peacemakers. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst after righteousness. And he starts to lay out this new idea of what it means to be a community. Prior to that, the Jewish people around them, they saw themselves either unified by ethnicity. Oh, we're all children of Abraham. We're all children of Abraham. Or they were unified over, there were the Samaritans who only kept to the first 5 books of the Bible. And then there were, the Pharisees that had all of the prophecy. And, hey, you know what? We're even going to codify a law to make sure that we don't even possibly transgress the law that God has given to us. And they were divided that way. But the one thing that they weren't focused on was exactly what Jesus was talking about here. They were not a community focused on applying justice and mercy and righteousness and holiness. And so Jesus starts to say, this is what I want you to be. This is the kingdom of God. That you want to see what the kingdom of God looks like? Here's a story about a Samaritan who takes care of a Jew that's been beaten up and left on the side of the road. He's got no reason to do it. It's not going to benefit him at all. In fact, it's going to end up costing him. And yet he does it. Why? Because blessed are the merciful. Blessed are the poor. And so we become called to that. And as the gospel starts to spread out after the events of the crucifixion and the resurrection, we start to see more and more about how the community of those early Christians starts to embody what Jesus was talking about, how they began to care for one another, how they began to look out for one another. Heck, the church in Jerusalem begins to suffer because they don't have enough. They're under persecution and everything, and so Paul starts going to these Gentiles, which previously the Jewish people the Jewish Christians had considered to be not somebody I really want to deal with. But they start going out and collecting money to provide for the church in Jerusalem, our brothers that are over here that are suffering. And then they start caring for their community about them. I want you to look at another verse here. First Peter 2:1 or 2:11, sorry. Peter starts to talk to the church about how they're to interact in the world around them. He says, "Beloved, I urge you as sojourners and exiles to abstain from the passions of the flesh, which wage war against your soul." Once again, the scriptures come around to remember where you came from. Sojourners, exiles. You're in the midst of these Gentiles. Keep your conduct honorable. So he says in verse 12, keep your conduct honorable so they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day of their visitation. This is what we can be about. So if the core of what we are supposed to do is to enact God's will in this world, if the core of what we are supposed to do is to be his representative in this world, and that we do that by looking back at where we were when God found us. And if we look back and say, we were once slaves to our own ideas, slaves to our own passions, slaves to, you know where you were. I know where I was. I know the darkness in my heart. I know what God took me out of. And if I can look at myself and say, God reached in and took a hold of that and transformed it and saved me and brought me out of the darkness, how can we not do the same? But what form does that take? And I guess that is the next big thing. And for us here at Emmanuel Mission, that became the next big hurdle to get over. I think we all recognize that there's a calling on us individually, that God asks us to be involved in certain things, and God asks us to respond individually to the needy, to those that are in need of hearing of his love and his mercy. But there's also a corporate call on us, the call for us as Christians. How do we minister into this world? So I took some time after looking at the scripture to find our foundation. I took some time then and looked at our history and started asking myself, well, then how does the church begin to minister in the world around it? And it's very interesting. When you look at how the church has done this, I would say at least up until the 20th century, probably well into the 20th century, the church has sent out missionaries. But it hasn't sent out individuals. It sent out missionary groups to do things. Now, at the beginning, it was just the church in that community. There wasn't, however, hundreds of millions of denominations and groups and this, that, and the other. It was just the church in Jerusalem, the church in Ephesus, the church here, there, and every place. And the church started first making sure that its brothers and sisters were taken care of. We provide for one another. We look out for one another. I can't tell you how many times Anna and I have had to just give thanks over and over and over for the support, for the help, for the assistance that we have received from my brothers and sisters in the MSJ, in the diocese, across denominations. We don't like being needy people, but circumstances are what they are, and often there's no way for us to make it through without you all. And that's been glorious. That's been wonderful. And so that's how the church begins. It starts off doing this among themselves, but it quickly moves into the civitas in amongst the citizens of the town, they realize that their own thriving has something to do with the thriving of the town, and their neighbors. And so they start caring for their neighbors. They start reaching out to them, regardless of whether these people worship as they do, regardless of of whether they are pagans. They just are people in need, and so we'll take care of them. And that's one of the great things that Rome and the Greek world recognizes about them, is that even in spite of the fact that we think that they kill and eat babies, you know, they still are these people that, when all of us leave everyone else behind, they step in and take care of everyone. When there's these great plagues that break out, the people that remain to help the people that are afflicted by the plague are the Christians. They're helping out. They're assisting. They're making sure that everybody's taken care of, and you know, that mercy and that justice and that walking humbly before God thing starts to take hold, and that becomes a big part of who the church is. Now, once the church becomes respectable, it starts to be tolerated by the empire, actually ends up becoming somewhat of an official religion of the empire. Some of these things start getting handed over to the government. They start to expect, well, the emperor is going to make sure that this gets taken care of. And the church starts to step back a little bit. And yet, into the midst of that, and this is the cool thing, into the midst of that, when the church starts going, well, you know, we don't have to worry about that as much anymore. We can focus in on this, that, and the other thing. All of a sudden, you've got these groups of Cenobite monks. Cenobite monks. There, I said it. Who start living into community, initially to just make sure that they don't get infected by all this nonsense that's going on around them. But as they do that, they start living out a Christian life amongst the community that's near them. They start developing things like hospitals. They start to do things like educate the nobility. Okay, the nobility is looking for people to educate their children, so they send them to monasteries. And so not only do they learn their letters and their law and this, that, and the other, but they learn the scriptures. They learn things like, he has shown you, oh man, what you should do. They start learning things like, blessed are the meek. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst after righteousness. And so the nobility starts to learn these things. And so this message starts going out. We get a little bit of even a different model in the early Celtic monks who start to, and please excuse me, I got to grab some of my notes here. Some of the Celtic monks start to have communities that build up around their monasteries, which is really amazing when you think about it. And so, you know, the monastery becomes the center of the community, and you start to see that happening. Later on, we start seeing various groups being sent out, and there we go. Lost my note there for a second. And by the 16th century, we start to see these societies, these groups, these communities of missionaries start to arise. In the 16th century, you have St. Vincent de Paul. Interestingly, started out as a chaplain to galley slaves, and out of that started to build a group of people that just wanted to care for those that did not have much and those that were disadvantaged. He gathered around him a bunch of priests who were serving small little communities, small villages around. And he expected them to start to care for the poor out of a common life. They started to share a rule of life together. To help hold them up as they're going through this ministry. And so we start to see those type of things pop up in the 16th century. In the 17th century, we've got guys like Saint Benedict Joseph Labre, who is a man who so begins to identify with the homeless that he spends most of his life homeless in the streets of Rome. Everything that he does receive in support, he starts to give to all the homeless around him because he sees in them the face of Jesus. In England, in particular, we see the community at Little Gidding develop. And for those of you who have not looked into the community of Little Gidding, my gosh, you got to look at this. A lawyer by the name of Nicholas Farrar gets ready to retire. He's a churchman. He loves the church. He loves the Church of England, and but he's getting ready to retire. He finds a manor house in this community called Little Gidding, and on that manor there is a chapel. And he begins to form an idea that this chapel could be a place where prayer is being continually offered. And so he seeks orders as a deacon, asks the bishop to send him a priest so that the Holy Eucharist can be given. And he establishes this community of his extended family who make sure that prayer is constantly happening in that chapel. Round the clock, there's prayer going on there all the time. But not only do they live, and the Puritans of that era used to call it the nunnery at Gidding. But not only do they develop this community that's like that, but they also start teaching the children of the town. And so they teach the children of the town using what? Using the Bible, using the prayer book, teaching them how to read, how to reason, how to think. And it becomes this great movement. King Charles I is so impressed by it, and the work that they produce. They produce these harmonies of the Gospels to support themselves, and King Charles ends up getting one from them, becoming so impressed, and he visits there, and so this idea of living in community. Not only taking on a rule of life for yourself, but also figuring out what's needed in the community you're living in. And in Little Gidding, it was these children needed to be educated. They didn't know where else to go for this. Nicholas said, "We'll do it. We'll take care of that. We'll get that all set." Later on in the 18th century, we're kind of skipping ahead a little bit at a time. In the 18th century, you had these knuckleheads that were in Oxford, that like to do things a little methodically. A holy club filled with guys like John and Charles Wesley and George Whitefield, all Anglicans who begin to want to figure out, how do we live a holy life? How do we live a life that's pleasing unto God? And so they get up every day and they pray the morning prayers, and they read the scriptures, and they study it together, and they make sure they're attending daily Eucharist as often as they can, since they're at Oxford. But then they don't stop there. See, that's not the essence of their holy life. That's only part of their holy life. Then they go out and they start to do things like reform the prisons. Then they go out and John Wesley starts to preach about living a holy life and an enthusiastic life for God, a life that's filled with the Holy Spirit. And the Church of England says, well, you can preach that all you want, but it ain't gonna be in our chapels. So Wesley goes out and he finds that there are coal miners that don't ever get to receive the word of God because they're down in the coal mines all the time. And so he goes out and he preaches to them. And he organizes these groups of Methodists who not only serve the needs of those around them, but then also come together in these class meetings where they start to ask each other, are you progressing on to holiness? I love that. I love the fact that, and you guys know that my background is in Methodism, and I have a high respect for that those original class meetings, you start off those things like by asking each other, how is it with your soul? Are you progressing towards holiness? And they held each other accountable, and they asked what things you were doing to serve your fellow human beings, as well as those things that you were doing to serve God. Very much looking at loving God with everything we have, but also loving our neighbors ourselves. As you can tell, I'm kind of speeding through some of this, but that's okay. And then, of course, in the 19th century, you have our ancestors, the Oxford movement. The interesting thing about the Oxford movement is that it wasn't initially or even entirely about Catholic ritual. It was about Catholic doctrine. It was a recognition that the church was called to a ministry that followed in the footsteps of Jesus, that we were supposed to be incarnational, and that we were supposed to be sacramental in what we did. That this wasn't just for Sunday morning. This was for our entire life. And they began to recognize the church had responsibilities. The church didn't just sit there and receive, but the church had responsibility, that the state couldn't usurp those responsibilities that the church had. Sound familiar? I think we live in a situation nowadays where often the church or the state seems to want to do what the church has a responsibility to do. We need to reclaim that. We need to reclaim the fact that we have a responsibility to the people around us. We have movement. Obviously, if you know the history of this, some of the punishment for these Oxford guys who were stirring up trouble in the Church of England was, hey, let's send them to the least desirable parishes possible. And so they sent them to the slums. The interesting thing is that the guys from the Oxford movement and those people that would later on be called ritualists and Anglo-Catholics, they start to go, okay, we'll go there and we'll set up churches and we'll serve the people and we'll show the beauty of God in the midst of some of the worst places that you can imagine. So the fact that they were in these horrible places, I mean, London in the 19th century was not a pleasant place to be, especially down on the docks, especially in the slums. That's where all the criminal element hung out. That's where the prostitutes were. That's where you were literally stepping over people who were dying. That's how bad it was. But the folks from the Oxford movement and their sons, the ritualists, the Anglo-Catholics, went into these places willingly and set up hospitals, and they set up places for the drunks to dry out. They started caring for those that had no homes. And this became a huge part of who they were. In fact, let's get into Richard Benson and Charles Grafton, who start this organization for whom we kind of derive a little bit of our name, the Society of St. John the Evangelist. And they have this main house, this chapter house. These are a bunch of bachelor priests. They live together. They hold each other accountable. They have a rule of life that they obey. They, although they're not monks, they pray the daily office. They serve the chapels at Oxford. They do all these kind of things. And then as churches need them, they send out missionaries. Okay. And they send out the neatest thing I ever read was about this mission that took place in London, in which the Society of St. John the Evangelist sent out all these priests into downtown London to different churches, and they all did different things. They, some of them had, big processions where they carried banners and everything, and everybody was in their cassock and surplice and everything. And others, they had almost revivalistic meetings. But key to all of it was that they were going to be in and among the people. They were going to invite them in. They ended up having confession almost at every service they had, but they may not have called it confession. Sometimes they called it holy conversations, because you can get thrown in jail for doing confession because that was too Catholic. But what was so exciting to me about it was that these missionaries centralized in one place got sent out. They got sent out. That's our Anglo-Catholic heritage, is that we can send out missionaries, and we can send people out to do things in a sacramental, incarnational way. That's tremendous thing that we can accomplish. And then finally, you get into the 20th century, and you start seeing things like, especially among the homeless and the poor in the cities, you see things like the Dorothy Day and the Catholic worker movement. Many other groups like that. And we can point out examples after example after example. But the thing that really stuck with me as I was looking through the history of the church is that when the church has done its best missionary effort, when it has done its best mission effort, it has always been as part of a community, whether it be a mission society, whether it be a monastery, whether it be just a church, a parish that has taken on a specific ministry in a town. Our best work is done not by sending out individuals, but by sending out communities of people or developing communities of people. And that's what we've decided to do here in Oscoda. Emmanuel Mission started off with a desire to be a community of Christians serving the homeless population of northeastern Michigan. Somewhere along the line, out of necessity mostly, it lost some of that. And we're trying to rebuild that. I think God wants this to be a community of Christians in mission to this larger community. I think the Missionary Society of St. John the Evangelist can have a part of that in a very real way. I think we can become a missionary society, not simply in name only, but in practice. That we can spend our time and that we can focus in on training people to go out and begin these kind of communities, of supporting these kind of communities with not only our prayers and our gifts and those things, but also with personnel. You know, wouldn't it be great if that at assembly on a regular basis we were talking about, oh yeah, our St. Andrews sent 6 people over to Liberty, Kentucky to work with their school over there, or Holy Trinity sent up 3 guys to work up in Michigan in the cold north at the mission up there. Wouldn't that be a legacy? A legacy that we can invite others to be a part of. That's what's on my heart. That's what's been brewing in my heart so long now. And I know I've kind of had to rush through things in order to present this in kind of a tight package, but down at the core of it is a God that wants us to remember where he found us and how he had to reach in and help us. And if we're honest with ourselves, it was often through somebody else. And you and I can do the same thing. I see homeless people on our street all the time up here. And it's difficult. They're people that are difficult people. A lot of them have mental illness. A lot of them are trapped in substance abuse. Most of them have made really, really bad decisions in their lives. Can we really say that we're all that different? And yet God reached out to us, and I want Hope Anglican Chapel and I want Emmanuel Mission to be the people that reach out and say, you know what? Let us help you. Let us help remove obstacles in your life so that you can meet the one who can really, really fix this. Let's remove these things that are keeping you on the street and out of communication with God so that you can talk to God. We'll help you find a home. We'll help you find the help for your mental illness and for your substance abuse. Now, is there something you need to talk to God about? But that takes Christians to do. Not everybody's going to understand that. I'm having a problem right now in that when I talk to some of our secular partners who have been supporting this mission for a long time, when I start talking to them about the fact that I'm not looking to recruit volunteers, I'm looking to recruit missionaries. I get these looks like, huh? What does that mean? What does it mean that your board, quote unquote, board is your vestry and a mission society and a diocese? We don't understand. We can't fit that into our working definition. Okay, that's fine. But we can do it because we want to love people the way God has called us to love. And that means that we can't ignore the very spiritual aspect that needs to take place in their lives. So I'm hoping this is the beginning of a conversation that we can have as a society, that I can have with you guys individually if you want to. Miss talking with you, miss being there. I love you deeply. I love our mission society. And I think the best times are ahead for us. So go with God. Love you both. Love you both. Love you all. I'm assuming there's more than two of you sitting here watching this. Love you all. And we'll see you real soon. God bless.